Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up because this one's a doozy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The stories. Paramedic returned a ring to this hospital wing. The ring sat in a small evidence pouch with a folded intake label, and the label named this hospital wing. Security logged the delivery in the overnight book with a careful time, and they filmed the handoff at the ambulance bay. Calder Ruiz was 34, and he worked nights on a private ambulance that covered the mixed urban fringe. He drove a high-mileage rig with a sticky rear latch, and he kept a quiet notebook under the dash. He finished paperwork after sunrise when the cafeteria coffee tasted burnt and the elevators finally ran without packed gurneys. His simple plan for this morning made sense, and it fit the tired mood of the shift. He would drop the ring, sign the property line, and clock out before the traffic built. The ring was a plain yellow band with a shallow engraving, and the engraving read LK and May 14. He did not remember any patient who mentioned jewelry, and their overnight calls were ordinary transfers and one shortness of breath. The band came from under the bench cushion during cleanup, and he spotted it when a pen rolled and tapped. He pocketed the pouch because it felt wrong to leave it, and he headed for the East Wing desk. The East Wing used to hold telemetry and a step-down, and now it served as a rehab overflow when beds ran tight. The desk kept a property log from older times, and the same binder continued through years of tape and patchwork pages. The unit clerk looked at the label and frowned, and she called for the charge nurse by habit. The charge nurse checked the overnight admits and shook her head, and she said nothing matched a ring for this wing. She asked which patient lost it, and he told her none of their patients mentioned a ring at all. She said they could place it in central security, and they would open a claim if anyone asked later. He nodded but felt a tug, and the label still named this wing in plain handwriting. He asked if the desk ever handled stray property like that, and the charge nurse said it occasionally happened. A maintenance tech leaned from a ladder and listened, and he said the East Wing had its own ghosts by reputation. He laughed when the nurse shot a look, and he added that he meant the cardboard kind. He explained that old property envelopes sometimes turned up behind cabinets, and housekeeping would move them along. He said linens and small items traveled strange paths when movers closed floors, and people forgot until someone asked later. Calder thanked him, then he asked permission to check the binder for older notations. The clerk slid it over and pointed to a rule that said deliveries needed 2 staff signatures. The binder held thick pages with names and room numbers, and some entries noted patient transfers to other wings. Calder skimmed recent weeks and then months, and nothing showed the initials LK, or any ring notes. He asked if the wing ever logged items that did not belong to current patients, and the clerk said rarely. She remembered a wedding band that fell through a bed frame on a weekend, and it took months to track. She said a therapist found it during a lift motor replacement, and the family cried when they got the call. The clerk shrugged and said the hospital felt like a moving chest of drawers, and odds and ends migrated forever. Calder walked to security with the pouch, and the guard on duty scanned the label with a handheld. The guard said the pouch style looked older, and the zip strip color was not used anymore. The guard printed the receipt and asked for a description, and Calder gave the engraving as clearly as possible. The guard searched a property database and found no ring tickets for the wing, and his search covered 2 years by default. Calder asked if there were archived losses in older years, and the guard said records before 2014 were scanned PDFs. The guard called upstairs and requested access to a shared drive, and the wait felt like a small eternity. Calder stood under the camera bubble and reviewed his shift notes, and the notes listed 4 dispatch times with addresses redacted here. He wrote a short line about a transfer from a rehab floor with a pleasant dog calendar, and he wrote another about a night custodian who kept a radio. None of the lines mentioned a ring, and none of the patients wore jewelry in obvious ways. He opened his phone gallery and checked the bench photo he took for restocking, and the timestamp matched their return to the bay. The ring did not appear in that picture, and the bench looked clean and dull. He wondered if the ring slid loose after the photo when the rig shuttered, and the thought did not settle his nerves. The guard waved him back and offered a chair, and they opened a folder of ripped black and white scans. One report flagged an incident in the East Wing, and the date read May 14 of 2010. The note said a patient property bag failed during a bed change and a ring listed as L.K. went missing. The report said staff searched the room and linen hampers were checked in central processing. A second note added that the family could not be reached, and a voicemail box stayed full for weeks. The case closed without resolution, and the scan ended with a faded stamp that looked handmade. Calder felt the small click that happens when separate lines meet, and the label suddenly seemed heavier than its weight. He asked if the room number was legible, and the guard zoomed until the pixels turned into blocks. The number looked like 212 or 217, and the wing layout had changed since then. The guard said maintenance might have an old map, and a shop supervisor kept binders in a cage downstairs. Calder thanked him, and he asked to make a quick copy of the scan for his crew file. The guard printed the page and stamped a copy line, and he urged Calder to keep things simple with the wing. On the loading dock, a housekeeper pushed a rolling cart, and she mentioned hearing about a ring on the radio. She said her aunt worked here years ago as a transporter, and her aunt remembered a family who asked about LK. The aunt thought LK stood for Lena Kovacs, and that name showed up on a donor plaque somewhere. The housekeeper stressed that it was just a memory, and people mixed up stories after long shifts. Calder thanked her and asked which plaque she meant, and she guessed it could be by the therapy gym. He made a note with a star, and he promised nothing beyond a respectful check. Maintenance loaned him a binder with a taped spine, and the old East Wing diagram showed rooms from 190 to 230. A paper tab marked a wall removal year in 2005, and the spaces had been reconfigured since that renovation. The diagram showed linen chutes and mechanical closets, and one chute lined up behind the current rehab gym. Calder compared the faded room to a modern corner, and the old room 212 would be near the therapy office. He felt the workable line appear, and it had more gears than luck. He thanked the supervisor and returned the binder, and he set off toward the gym. The therapy office had a bulletin board with service pins, and a small photo showed a woman in scrubs named Kovacs. A caption said she ran a staff fundraiser in 2011, and the photo looked like a copy of a copy. Calder asked the receptionist if Miss Kovacs still worked there, and the receptionist said she retired years ago. The receptionist checked a directory and found no current contact, and then she opened a drawer with old alumni notes. She found a folded program from a memorial tea, and the newsletter said, Lena Kovacs lost a husband early. The print used careful language, and it did not mention the ring or the initials. Calder felt a chill that did not belong to superstition, and he asked security if he could call the number on the old scan. The guard said the number probably died years ago, and he recommended the hospital volunteer office for family links. Calder went there and explained the situation, and he kept details minimal and careful. The volunteer coordinator listened and nodded, and then she showed him a book of donor inscriptions. She pointed at a plaque near the rehab gym, and the name said, Kovacs Family Therapy Garden with a small leaf icon. She said the family sometimes visited during late summer, and she could pass a message through a general email. Calder returned to the East Wing desk and asked again to log the ring, and he added the old report number on the form. The charge nurse read his notes and raised an eyebrow, and she asked whether this was a lost patient or a lost object. Calder answered it was certainly an object, and he was trying to avoid making anyone hurt again. She stared at the band through the plastic and then nodded, and she initialed the line for custody. She called linen services and requested a search of older chutes, and she asked maintenance about a recent vibration test nearby. She then told Calder she appreciated the thoroughness, and she would add her number to the receipt. On his lunch break that arrived at almost noon, Calder called his partner from the shift and asked about the bench cushion. His partner said the cushion ripped months ago near the latch, and small things sometimes fell into that hollow void. He said he once lost a pen that rolled out 3 weeks later, and they both laughed about the gremlins. Calder asked if any hospital staff had borrowed their transport stretcher recently, and his partner said rehab used it during a power test yesterday. The partner said the rehab techs pushed the stretcher over a threshold that made the whole thing shudder. Calder pictured the ring jumping free inside the cushion, and the moment drew a simple line through time. He walked to biomedical engineering and asked about the rehab stretcher loan, and the tech on duty pulled an asset report. The report showed a loan to the East Wing therapy office, and the return time matched their arrival last night. The tech said the stretcher had a known rattle in the side rail, and small items could migrate if they slipped. Calder requested permission to inspect the rail, and the tech handed over a hex key with a cautious smile. He removed the end cap and tipped the rail, and a dust mix fell with a soft hiss. Nothing else emerged, and the ring hypothesis remained just that. And yet, it still felt reasonable. Calder tried laundry services next and asked whether a ring could travel from a chute to a truck and back. The supervisor said it happened rarely, and a ring could ride a torn bag to a cart and escape later. The supervisor said older chutes sometimes released surprises when motors kicked, and vibration made lost things walk. She said one time a pager chimed from a folded blanket, and everyone jumped because the model was ancient. She wrote down the ring details and promised to ask her staff, and she asked for the property receipt number. Calder thanked her and climbed the stairs because the elevator seemed suddenly crowded. A retired nurse named Myra arrived for a flu shot, and she recognized the old pouch design at the east desk. She said those pouches vanished after 2012, and she used to seal them with a blue strip. She looked at the initials and stopped, and she softly said Lena kept her maiden name for work. She remembered a shift when a patient requested a chaplain, and afterward a ring went missing from the bag. She said they turned the room upside down and found nothing, and she cried telling the family that week. She asked whether the ring was truly here now, and the charge nurse said it was in security as of this morning. Calder asked whether Myra could share a statement, and she agreed to write a short note with dates as best she could. Her handwriting looked steady for a long history, and she described a bed change and a linen swap. She recalled a code earlier that day in a nearby room, and equipment had moved through the hallway quickly. She said carts piled up while everyone managed the chaos, and the chute doors swung as orderlies cleared hampers. She noted that Lena worked that corridor and often stayed late, and she kept paperwork near the therapy office. Myra ended by saying the family did not push a complaint, and the grief felt huge enough already. Calder added the note to the property file, and he asked security to copy the PDF and the asset report. The guards stapled everything carefully and wrote a short chain of custody line, and then he called his supervisor. The supervisor arrived and listened without interruption, and he nodded at each small connective piece. He said it sounded plausible that the ring traveled by linen or by stretcher rail, and the return timing fit. He asked whether anyone had reached the Kovacs family, and the volunteer office answered that a general email was sent. He decided the ring should be placed with the wing director for now, and then returned when the family responded. Calder walked the ring to the wing director with the charge nurse, and the director unlocked a small safe by the desk. The director read the file twice and looked out at the therapy gym, and he seemed to count years without words. He thanked Calder for not turning this into a story beyond the facts, and he said the path felt honest. He said sometimes the building kept tiny traps from old renovations, and objects slid back into daylight when ready. He placed the ring pouch on a velvet pad, and he wrote the time and his name with a careful hand. He said they would hold the ring in the wing, and they would make sure the right people heard. That afternoon, a volunteer returned with a printed email, and the message contained a phone number that still worked. The director asked Calder to stay as a witness, and they called the number on speaker in a quiet office. A woman answered and identified herself as Mira, and she said she was Lena's niece by marriage. She listened to the summary and asked a few precise questions, and her voice shook on the second. She said her aunt still wore a thin band and a chain, and this sounded like her husband's original ring. She said the family visited the garden plaque every May, and they never stopped asking about a lost ring. They met in a neutral conference room with frosted glass, and the director set the pouch on the table. Mira brought a small photo from 2010, and the ring in the picture looked like the one in the pouch. She asked to hold it for a moment, and then she breathed as if she had been underwater too long. She pointed to a tiny scratch on the inner edge, and it matched a bike fall from their early years together. She explained that the initials were his and hers, and the date marked the wedding by a justice in a quiet office. She thanked the room and said she did not want a ceremony, and she was just grateful for care. Calder signed the witness line and pushed the pen toward the director, and the moment felt weightless and plain. Mira asked whether anyone would mind if she visited the therapy garden, and the director offered to walk her there. She asked if the ring could remain with the wing for a little while, and she wanted to place flowers first. The director said the wing would be honored, and he promised to contact her if any details surfaced later. Calder stood back and watched the distance between grief and closure collapse, and it looked like a hallway finally cleared. He nodded to the charge nurse and pocketed his notebook, and he promised to replace the bench cushions soon. 2 days later, the linen supervisor called Calder and said a tech found a torn seam in the stretcher cover. The tear ran along a hidden edge that opened under vibration, and small things could hide there without notice. The tech also found a coin lodged deep inside, and its date hit the same era noted in the file. The supervisor said this was not proof of the ring path, and it felt like a friendly witness. Calder took a picture of the seam and added it to the binder, and he logged the maintenance request for replacement. The small chain of custody now included the rail and the cover, and the line grew stronger without pretending certainty. The wing director arranged a short gathering by the therapy garden, and a few staff who remembered Lena came by. They set a small card that said, "Returned to the East Wing," and they left space for a family decision. Mira arrived with her 2 cousins and a bouquet, and she asked if she could speak to the gathered staff. She thanked everyone for treating the story with hands open, and she said the ring could stay displayed for 1 week. After that week, she would take it home, and she would bring it back every May as a quiet practice. People nodded because the balance felt right, and the garden bench caught the late light gently. Calder watched from the edge with his coffee, and he remembered the pen that tapped the bench before he saw the ring. He thought about the way buildings hold on to things, and how people read meaning into dust and echo. He thought about dispatch logs that look cold until someone traces them, and then the script becomes a real day. He considered the lines that join strangers into an honest arc, and he respected each break where evidence speaks. The ring did not prove fate, and it did prove persistence, and it showed that care can be methodical. He left the garden before the applause faded, and he headed for the bay to start another shift. On his next overnight run, he noticed the new bench cushion, and it no longer swallowed dropped pens into hiding. He kept his notebook on the dash and wrote a line about the East Wing, and he kept the words simple. He wrote that a ring once traveled the hospital like a seed on wind, and the wind finally stopped here. He wrote that people made that stop happen by checking maps and calling quietly, and by not rushing a story. He wrote that the wing felt different now, and the difference came from patience more than any grand event. He closed the book and turned on the radio, and the night answered with the ordinary sound of work. Weeks later, the director sent a copy of a small framed note, and it now sat by the garden plaque. The note stated that a staff family recovered a long-missing ring, and it had rested here for a time. It stated that the return involved a paramedic, a clerk, a guard, a supervisor, and a retired nurse. It added that the file included a torn stretcher cover and a scan dated May 14 of 2010. It invited no legend and made no claim beyond the chain of quotes and receipts, and it felt right that way. Calder clipped the note into a shift binder and smiled, and then he got called out for a routine transfer. On the way past the East Wing doors, he slowed and looked in, and the desk lamp made the binder glow. The charge nurse raised a hand without words, and the unit seemed calm in the bright noon. He thought again about how evidence moves on small wheels and how the best stories stay quiet when finished. He considered how many families carry unclosed lines and how sometimes a lost object can stitch one shut. He knew this ring did not solve grief, and it gave shape to a memory that had gone thin with years. He swung the rig into the daylight and felt the road through the wheel, and the city rolled forward like usual. Months later, he learned that Mira returned each May with flowers, and she touched the glass with the ring inside. The volunteer office kept the file updated in a narrow drawer, and the drawer label read East Wing Recoveries. Security replaced the camera bubble over the bay and kept the old unit for parts, and they joked about relics. The maintenance supervisor finally tossed the torn cover after documenting it, and he felt oddly proud of the careful record. The hospital moved through another winter without big headlines, and the garden kept the same soft wind under the windows. Calder kept working nights and never chased mention, and the crew understood without any speech at all. He still told new hires one short version during checkout, and he kept the details clear of romance. He said a ring with initials LK turned up under a bench after a stretcher loan, and the label named this wing. He said the date on the old report matched the engraving, and the linen path explained the long delay. He said good records and patient calls made the circle close, and that promise is why they log everything. He said someone cried without making a scene, and that is how truth usually presents itself at work. Then he pointed to the property pouch drawer and the fresh bench cushion, and he told them to check twice. Calder visited the garden once more after a busy night, and he stood alone before the building woke completely. He watched sun slide across the plaque letters until the leaf icon warmed, and the quiet felt unearned and good. He thought of how small choices build bridges that do not announce themselves, and then one step reveals the span. He remembered a retired nurse who wrote a careful line and a housekeeper who shared a family guess. He remembered a guard who kept files neat and a director who knew not to fill silence. He placed his palm on the cool railing and chose no grand meaning, and he simply wished everyone a gentle day. The ring returned to this hospital wing by documented steps, and the steps were ordinary and human and steady. The story did not need a mystery beyond time and movement, and it showed how rooms keep modest promises. He considered that a bench cushion, a torn cover, and a faded scan can hold a family together again. He thought that is enough for any place built to heal, and he walked back to the bay without speaking. He started the rig and checked the lights, and the reflections blinked across the wet asphalt. He breathed, then he rolled toward the morning traffic, and the work met him with the same quiet weight. The stories. The night guard, who logged footsteps beneath the church basement. He logged the first footsteps at 2:14, then again at 3:05, and nothing about those times made sense. The basement lights stayed off, the motion sensor blinked idle green, yet something moved under the concrete where no hallway existed. The night guard was named Alaric Boone, age 54, a retired freight dispatcher who took quiet work after his divorce. He covered the overnight shift at a weathered church on a bluff, a place with a gym, a pantry, and a low stone basement. His simple goal for that Tuesday was making rounds, checking doors, keeping the coffee hot, and finishing a crossword before sunrise. During his second loop, he heard the first set, a faint two-beat rhythm under the boiler room, steady and human. He froze by the cinder block wall, his pencil lifted, and he realized he could feel the vibration through his shoes. He marked the time in his pocket notebook, then radioed a single check-in to keep the board honest. The church sat near a small river where old mills once ran, and tunnels stitched the slope like forgotten seams. He had heard stories from lunch volunteers about a coal chute, a dumbwaiter, even a choir passage sealed long ago. None of those old features mapped exactly to the boiler room, which sat on fresh concrete poured after a flood in 2005. Alaric finished the round and told himself it was heat pipes, which seemed reasonable, though the tempo was wrong. The boiler was off to save fuel, set to wait closer to dawn, and the thermostats showed a flat night. He waited near the fuse panel and heard it again, slow steps south to north, then quiet like someone listening. He walked upstairs and checked the parking lot, which held a single sedan from a choir tenor who worked late. Across the street, the antique shop was dark, its sign unlit, the display of rotary phones a grid of dust. The guard wrote the second time down, circled it, and added a question mark he would rather have avoided. He kept a clean log because writing straight helped his nerves. A trick learned dispatching trucks through winter storms. His notebook already listed door tests, flashlight levels, and notes about the food pantry deliveries with initials and counts. Now it held two odd entries about a place that should have been solid fill and reinforced slab. On Wednesday, he set a baseline, because the simplest first step is confirming the pattern before trying explanations. He arrived 10 minutes early, brewed coffee, and walked the perimeter before the staff left and the alarms armed. He chalked a thin line along the boiler room floor, just a mark to see if any hairline crack shifted. At 2:17, he felt the same two-beat rhythm. Heel, then toe, careful, like someone stepping between puddles. It moved toward the old pantry wall, paused, then returned, and he heard a small scrape, as if brushing stone. He checked the chalk line and found nothing disturbed, which frustrated him more than if he had found scuffs. He called the on-call contact listed as Pastor Lionel Cade, age 61, a spare-voiced man who rarely slept. The pastor answered and said the church once tied into a storm culvert and the city sealed it after floods. He added that the map might be wrong, since old projects drifted from paperwork when donations moved faster than permits. The footsteps returned at 3:11, and he recorded them by holding his phone against the wall, letting the mic listen. The audio picked up a rhythmic, bassy thump and a single metal tick, like a ring hitting a pipe. He labeled the file with the date and the time and sent it to himself because he backed up everything. On Thursday, he walked the block in the afternoon and spoke with Rhea Voss, age 47, the daytime custodian. She said a volunteer once mentioned a hatch under the choir risers, then shrugged and said that was before her time. She also said a city crew excavated near the alley last winter, chasing a water pressure loss on the block. He pulled the Public Works hotline and asked for archived lines, using calm words and the steady cadence that gets patience. The operator routed him to records, where an email arrived with basic utility diagrams marked revised after 2005. The drawing placed a retired branch running 30 feet under the church, labeled Service Abandoned with a faint dotted spur. He printed the map and folded it into his pocket, then took his shift with a small knot riding his stomach. That night, the sound came earlier, 1:59, and closer to the North Foundation, which meant a path existed. He pressed his ear to the block, ignored the smell of dust and fuel oil, and heard soft breathing between steps. He decided to compare his notes against external clocks, a habit from dispatch that filtered coincidence from signal with patience. He checked transit schedules and found a freight delivery to the antique shop at midnight every other day, closed route. He marked those days with a triangle in the margin, then noticed the footsteps fell hours after the truck departed. On Friday, he asked the food pantry director, a patient woman named Mavis Alcott, age 50, whether someone used the basement. She said the pantry closed at 6 and the keys were tracked. Then she looked worried and asked if something happened. He told her he heard odd noise, nothing dangerous yet, and he would keep her informed before calling the police. He reached out to a friend who knew Boots by tread, a park ranger named Pietro Licari, age 42. Pietro listened to the phone recording and said the spacing suggested a careful adult, not a kid, likely carrying weight. He told Alaric to watch for a scrape on the off foot, a marker of someone testing boards or stones. That night, Alaric brought a cheap wildlife camera from a hardware store, just a unit that logged sound and temperature changes. He set it in the boiler room, not for video since there was nothing to see, but for time-stamped audio. He also sprinkled a narrow ribbon of flour near the expansion joint because footprints sometimes post where eyes cannot. At 2:08, the floor hummed lightly, the air felt cooler near the wall, and the camera clicked after a shift. Later, he played it back and heard a new detail, a small spray like water under pressure, then a hand tap. It sounded like someone touched a pipe and felt for vibration, which made the knot in his stomach tighten. On Saturday afternoon, he visited the public library and asked for old fire insurance maps, the kind surveyors hoarded. The librarian brought a set from 1948 and 1963, which showed a coal room under the choir. A narrow passage ran toward the river, marked as service, with a note stating shared utility with neighboring parcel. The neighboring parcel matched the antique shop, which made sense to old builders who shared trenches and split costs when money was scarce. He copied the sheet and took it to the pastor, who studied the lines, then sighed and rubbed his jaw. The pastor said a previous board closed the passage after a minor flood, then let the city handle whatever remained. Alaric asked permission to open the old choir risers to check for a hatch, and the pastor agreed to supervised access. They pulled 2 sections and found only plywood and dust, which meant the hatch was either gone or moved. Yet along the north sill, a set of nails showed different age, darker and uneven, as if boards were reused. That night, the footsteps ran later, almost 4, and quicker, like someone in a hurry who disliked being underground. He thought about calling the police, but worried he would deliver a false alarm and lose the trust he needed. Instead, he called the non-emergency line and reported suspicious subterranean noise, and the dispatcher logged it with a routine number. On Sunday morning, a congregant named Basil Ortega, age 60, told him he once saw steam venting in the alley. Basil said it happened near a rusted rectangle that looked like an access panel, then he made a helpless shrug. He also said an unfamiliar white van loaded crates behind the antique shop 2 nights earlier, long after the truck left. Alaric used his lunch to walk the alley, where he found a metal cover sunk into cracked asphalt beside an old drain. The cover was not city standard, the screws mismatched, the edges marked by recent scrapes where a bar pried. He took photos from 3 angles and emailed them to the pastor, then placed a tiny pencil mark by a bolt. He returned that night and listened, and when the footsteps began, he watched his phone clock and checked the flour. The new powder held a single faint dent by the joint, not a full print, but enough to show pressure. He leaned closer and smelled faint bleach, which meant someone cared about leaving little behind, a detail that narrowed possibilities. On Monday, he flagged the city water department and asked whether any reports showed pressure fluctuations overnight in that block. A supervisor called back and said there were brief spikes every few nights around 3, like a valve opening and closing. He added that an inspector noted a missing cap on a retired service branch near the river last winter. That call changed the tone, because pressure spikes paired with footsteps turned from mystery to infrastructure problem with risk. He told the pastor he would ask police for a walkthrough, then called the same dispatcher and requested a non-emergency assist. A patrol officer arrived with calm posture and a flashlight, listened to the audio, and agreed to a careful look. They checked the alley cover first and found the pencil mark missing, replaced by a fresh smear of dirt and oil. The officer requested a utility truck, and a crew appeared with a wrench and a portable meter that hummed softly. The crew measured sound through the cover and picked up flow. Not strong, but a whisper moving in pulses like breathing. They paused for a supervisor, who arrived with a locked case that held a camera snake used on drains and conduits. The team fed the lens past the cover and into a rough concrete passage that curved toward the church foundation. The view showed shoe scuffs on the dust, then a brass T-valve patched into an old water line with tape. The supervisor killed the street feed, then pointed at the tape and said someone had no license for that kind of work. He also said a misthreaded cap could vent gas from the adjacent service, which shifted the conversation from curiosity to hazard. The officer requested a second unit to secure the block, and they cleared the alley while keeping voices low. Inside the church, Alaric stood by the boiler room while the utility meter ticked, confirming a slight pressure bleed through the slab. The footsteps started again, softer this time, then stopped when the water cut out, which pinned the pattern with confidence. He radioed the officer, who whispered that someone was still down there, then signaled the team to quiet. A darker shape glided past the camera lens, and a hand reached to the valve, then froze when it found no resistance. The hand wore a thin mechanic glove with a tear at the knuckle, a detail that stood out like a flag. The officer announced presence through the cover, voice firm without volume, telling the person to stay still and breathe easy. A minute stretched heavy, then a voice answered, shaky and tired, saying he was stuck because the valve handle jammed. The team opened the cover and escorted out a man in his late 30s, pale, layered in dust and damp. He gave his name as Trenton Vale, age 38, the owner of the antique shop across the street with deliveries. He said he entered the old service passage months ago after a plumber showed a way to run a supplemental water line. He said he needed pressure for cleaning and steaming items, though his meter and bills did not match the usage schedule. He admitted he liked the privacy, then insisted he never touched the gas, which the utility crew would later verify. They checked his shop and found a narrow door behind a rack of film cameras that opened onto the same cracked alley. There were wet footprints on the threshold, hex-patterned soles with a little drag on the right, matching the sound spacing. There was a box of brass fittings, a saw with minimal filings, and a cardboard tray holding mismatched valve caps. At the station, according to the later report, he told them a contractor left the tool and he only learned by watching. He said the passage felt safer at night because the street was empty and he liked the quiet under the church. He also said he heard a bell once through the stone and timed his movements between scheduled campus patrols. The city documented the patched valve, sealed the retired branch, and fined the shop for unauthorized connection and trespass through utility right-of-way. The gas line near the valve showed no tampering, which eased everyone, though the near miss tightened throats along the block. The police shared a copy of the dispatch log, noting the initial call as checked and secured, Ulrich printed the log and glued it into his notebook beside the first pencil scrawl about the 2-beat rhythm. He added a short summary stating that the footsteps tracked to an illegal water tap under the slab, then paused. He wrote that the timing aligned with utility spikes, and the alley cover thread marks confirmed regular access before the shutdown. The pastor thanked him in a staff meeting, with witnesses confirming calm handling and careful records that guided city response. Rhea patted his shoulder and said the flower idea was odd and smart, then promised to mop where he dusted. Mavis delivered coffee and said the pantry would have closed for days if the water had been fouled by sediment. Pietro called and laughed softly, saying the drag heard in the recording matched the right boot scuff found at the door. He said the pattern on the sole looked like an old surplus boot, hex blocks that turned slick on damp concrete. He liked that a simple tape recorder pinned a path better than a dozen guesses and said, "Well done." Weeks later, the utility crew returned and filled the passage with flowable mix, a gray slurry that hardens without voids. They left a small marker in the alley for the map, a stamped square showing the retired line and closure date. Inside the boiler room, the floor stayed quiet. The green light blinked the same, and the chalk line gathered dust. People asked Alaric if he was scared while listening to footsteps underneath, and he always answered with a half smile. He said fear is different from alert, and alert is what he used when tracking trucks through black ice before sunrise. He also said the quiet afterward felt heavier than the noise because silence makes you question whether you imagined everything. He kept the notebook in his locker and reread the first pages when he doubted why small details matter during routine nights. The triangle marks still sat by the delivery days, and the circles still highlighted the times that repeated like a clock. He had added a final entry, stating that listening is a skill, and that meters and maps are companions. Trenton kept the shop open under a suspended operations agreement, limited hours, supervised water, and a written promise about deliveries. He came by once with a receipt and asked the pastor to sign a community service form for repair work around the lot. He paused near the boiler room door and stared at the concrete, then thanked Alaric without meeting his eyes. Alaric nodded and said, "Take care," then wrote a line later that night about how people choose their own pressure. He meant water and he meant life, and the line read corny on the page, so he crossed a word and moved on. He folded the notebook closed, poured fresh coffee, and walked the church perimeter while the river hummed under the bluff. He still listened in places others ignored because careful listening had made a map where drawings ended and footsteps began. He carried the printed utility sketch until the paper softened, then kept the new revised copy with the closure stamp. He filed both in a manila folder labeled basement under the church, just a marker in case memory failed years later. In his mind, the story stayed simple. A man heard footsteps where no hallway should run and wrote the times carefully. The notes pressed outward into witnesses, maps, meters, and one rusted cover that told the truth when a bolt turned. The payoff was not drama, but a good fix, which is better, and the quiet afterward made sense again. The stories. Motel room key log raised a warning at noon. The motel stood behind a tired strip mall where the highway bent east, and the room key log flagged a warning at noon. The manager said it had never done that for a single guest before, and the front desk software timestamp looked clean. Tamsin Rourke was 38, and she worked as a freelance transcriptionist who liked quiet rooms near highways. She checked in after a morning dental appointment, and she asked for a corner room away from the ice machine. Her plan was simple and forgettable, and she would upload 2 interviews before dinner without distractions. She had a cheap grocery salad chilling in the mini fridge, and she set her laptop near the lamp. The incident started when she left for a quick walk along the frontage road, and she returned before lunch. The red light on the lock blinked twice when she placed her key. And then the handle felt sticky for a second. She slid the key again, and the green light appeared, and the door opened without resistance. Something in the room felt slightly wrong, and her neat habits made that feeling hard to dismiss. Her notebook sat an inch off its earlier square alignment, and the privacy latch hung down at a different angle. The remote was upside down on the bed runner, and the curtains were parted just enough to show the lot. She did not panic, and she checked the window first, then the bathroom, then the closet. Nothing obvious was missing, and nothing valuable looked disturbed, and the safe still clicked with the same code. The manager, a steady man named Karim Doss with a careful way of talking, came up with a portable printer. He said the lock system kept an audit trail, and he could print the last 50 entries for peace of mind. He pressed a button on the encoder box, and a strip of paper fed out with lines that looked like a receipt. He pointed at a line that read, "Warning at 12:00," and he frowned at the code beside it. Karim said the warning usually meant repeated wrong keys, or a master key used in the wrong sequence. He asked whether she had trouble at the door, and she said the first swipe was odd, but it finally worked. He said housekeeping had not reached the swing yet, and the schedule showed rooms 5 through 10 blocked for later. He also said maintenance had no work orders near her room, and the pool pump had their focus today. Tamsin asked for a copy of the printout, and he tore the strip carefully and handed it to her. He said the desk software would mirror the entries, and the access times should match the paper record. He offered to change her room, and she said she preferred to stay if he could figure out the timing. She needed to finish her files, and moving would cost an hour of careful setup that already worked. He left to check the system downstairs, and she began a small investigation with habits learned from years of odd jobs. She took pictures of the desk layout, and she wrote down the position of the remote and notebook. She opened the fridge and felt the salad lid, and condensation traced the shape of her thumb. She photographed the hallway from her doorway, and she watched the corner mirror for anyone watching her room. Her phone showed an unknown missed call at 11:59, and the voicemail held only air and a soft tap. The timestamp placed the call 1 minute before noon, and that matched the printed warning by chance or design. She saved the file and wrote voicemail at 11:59 on a sticky note, then kept going. She recorded a short clip of the lock blinking pattern, and she took a still of the latch angle. Karim returned with a more complex explanation, and he looked both apologetic and curious. He said the central software showed 4 events around noon, and 2 were standard heartbeat checks. He said the third line was the warning, and the fourth line was her successful entry. He said the heartbeat checks were normal, and his vendor insisted those never touched the door memory. She asked who else had access to the master keys, and he listed his assistant and the head housekeeper. He said the shift had started late because of a staffing issue, and nobody had departed the laundry room until after the storm warning cleared. He looked out the window for a second, and the clouds were breaking over the lot. He said he could pull camera footage of the hall, and he offered to show her right away. They stood in a back office that smelled like detergent, and a small monitor rendered yesterday like a shaky stage. The hallway camera faced the vending alcove, and her door showed only as a sliver to the right. She could see the housekeeping cart parked across from a stairwell, and the garbage bag over its handle moved like a slow flag. She could also see the timestamp in the corner, and it froze now and then. Karim scrubbed to 11:58, and the hallway stayed empty except for a flicker near her door. He paused and rewound, and the ghost of a reflection crossed the chrome of the vending machine. The time stamped 12:00 when a shadow fell across the carpet, and then the monitor hiccuped through 4 frames. When it recovered, the cart stood an inch closer to the stairwell, and a candy bar wrapper twitched near the baseboard. He said the recorder sometimes skipped frames when the network hiccuped, and the storm probably did that earlier too. He said he would export the clip for backup, and he pressed a key that made the machine work. He printed another lock log at the front desk, and he noticed the codes looked different than the hallway printer. He muttered that the right column no longer showed the same vendor identifiers. Then he shrugged. Tamsin stayed gentle but persistent, and she asked for the front desk call records for the last 2 hours. He logged into the phone system and printed a list, and the sheet showed her incoming call at 11:59. He said the number looked like a regional call center trunk, and he did not recognize the exchange. He also pointed to a call from housekeeping to the desk at 11:47, and the note field read linens. She walked back to the room and pushed the privacy latch up, and she placed a glass against the door to hold it steady. She laid the 2 printouts side by side and traced the times with a pen, and she felt the rhythm of a pattern. The warning line sat like a pivot between routine checks, and the voicemail landed like a pebble against glass. She put her ear to the door and listened for wheels, then returned to the desk. Her own notes from the morning had a small clue that now felt louder, and she leaned into it. The motel website had listed check-in at 3, and the desk allowed 11 that day after a phone request She remembered the clerk saying the system was fussy about early openings and he had to enable the room manually. She asked whether that action wrote to the door, and he had said it usually did not write outside the server. She decided to create a timeline using what she had, and she kept her sentences short inside her head. She wrote walk begins at 11:25, and she wrote return at 11:58 by phone clock. She marked unknown call at 11:59, and she marked warning at noon per log. She marked successful entry after noon, and she left a space under the hallway camera skip. She started checking external sources that could anchor the minute hand, and she searched for weather alerts. The city office had posted a gust advisory that morning, and the timestamp read 11:49 on the archive page. The motel shared the notice on a social feed, and that repost time read 11:52. She noted those times and circled the hallway camera skip, then took another breath. 2 doors down, a long-term guest named Felton Jarvie stepped out with a laundry bag, and he watched her writing with polite curiosity. He wore a maintenance polo from a utility company, and his hands were clean in a careful way. He asked if everything was all right, and she said the door log showed a warning while she was gone. He said he heard a tap near noon from her door, and he thought it was someone knocking softly. Felton told her he had walked past the vending alcove at 11:55, and the housekeeping cart was not there then. He said the head housekeeper usually parked by the elevator, and moving the cart to the stairwell meant a quick run. He said the stairwell door sometimes stuck in humid weather, and people jiggled it with hip or shoulder. He offered that detail without drama, and he returned to his laundry with a nod. She wrote witness heard soft tap near noon, and she wrote cart location changed between 11:55 and noon. She returned to the office and asked Karyam whether any staff used the stairwell before lunch. He said the head housekeeper clocked a call to the desk for linens at 11:47, and she likely went down the stairs to the supply room. He said he could ask her directly, and he picked up the radio. The head housekeeper, a brisk woman named Vina Ortega, arrived with a ring of keys and an honest face. She said she did not touch room 9 that morning, and she stayed focused on laundry because 2 new hires were out. She said she parked the cart by the stairwell at around 11:56, and she ran down for pillowcases. She said she saw a man on the landing who said he was looking for the ice machine. Vina described the man in a way that felt practical, and Tamsin wrote each point without rushing. He wore a light jacket with a stitched logo that looked like a mountain, and he carried a slim plastic folder. He kept his head down when he passed her, and he said something like, "Sorry, wrong turn," in a low voice. Vina said she did not see him after that moment, and she returned with pillowcases within 2 minutes. Karyam asked whether the man entered any rooms, and Vina said no with a clear shake of her head. She added that the folder looked like those carriers used by sales reps who drop off rate sheets, and she shrugged. Tamsin asked if any vendors had appointments scheduled around noon, and Karyam checked a clipboard near the computer. He said a door lock vendor had promised a firmware push window this week, and the note read, "Watch for noon checks." He called the vendor number from the contract, and a recorded line explained a service window had occurred overnight earlier that week. The recording mentioned that local controllers might resynchronize during the next heartbeat, and some systems would show noon test entries. It said the entries should not appear as warnings, and any warning codes indicated a local misconfiguration with time settings. Karyam put the phone down slowly and exhaled. This turned the printed warning into something less mysterious and more technical, and yet the soft tap and shifted items remained. Tamsin asked whether the motel had shifted clocks recently, and he said they had updated everything after a power blink in late spring. He said the head housekeeper never touched the controller closet, and only he and the assistant manager had the key. He said the assistant was off-site today, and the key hung in his pocket. Tamsin asked for the stairwell camera if available, and he said that stairwell lacked coverage by an inch of budget. She asked whether a rear door camera covered the bottom of those stairs, and he nodded with measured relief. They pulled up the rear camera, and a narrow view showed the delivery alley and a sliver of the stairwell door. The timestamp now froze less often, and the light shifted across an oil stain like a lazy sundial. At 11:58 by the camera clock, the stairwell door opened just enough to spill a thin triangle of light. A figure in a light jacket stepped into the frame, and the stitched logo matched Vina's description by shape. He held a slim plastic folder against his side, and the posture looked like someone carrying documents that should not bend. He walked toward the alley exit, and he kept his head angled away from the lens. Karim printed the clip details and wrote down the frame references, and he looked grateful for the anchor. He called the city non-emergency line and reported a suspicious trespass with time and description, and he received a reference number. Tamsin stayed in the office while he spoke, and she scanned the clip again for details that might connect. The jacket logo looked familiar, and she leaned closer to the screen. She remembered a flyer in the lobby about avalanche readiness training from a regional outdoor store, and the mountain logo resembled that brand. She found a photo of the flyer in her morning snapshots, and the triangles of the logo matched in a crude way. She wrote possible brand match on her notes, and then she reconsidered the cleaner explanation. She asked whether any delivery drivers wore similar jackets from a local supplier. Karim said a laundry service delivered on Tuesdays, and their shirts had a wave rather than a peak. He said a copier technician had visited last month, and his vest reflected light in bright stripes. He also said a door lock vendor rep had visited in 2019, and that rep carried a thin folder and spoke softly. He pointed to an old business card taped inside a drawer, and the logo on the card was a shield. Tamsin returned to the voicemail and listened again, and the soft tap in the recording felt more like a brushed microphone. She increased the playback speed, and the hiss changed pattern, and the tap now sounded like a door meeting a frame. She looked at the lock and imagined someone swiping a card and bumping the door with a shoulder, then backing off. The warning at noon could align with an invalid swipe, and the soft tap could be that bump. She compared the hallway camera skip with the rear camera movement, and a pattern gained weight. The hallway camera froze near noon, exactly when the stairwell door opened downstairs, and the network load could explain that. The housekeeping cart shift lined up with Vina jogging to the supply room, and the man could have slipped past as she turned. The voicemail hit her phone as the man reached the bottom door, and the network jitter added noise. She also checked her own photos from the morning, and one showed the privacy latch at a different angle before she left. The after image showed the latch touching a scuff on the frame, and the before image left a finger of space. That meant someone likely opened the door enough to disturb the latch, then reset it with an unfamiliar hand. The remote upside down could be a subtle cue of a rushed search or simply clumsy housekeeping. The twist arrived when she noticed the line at the very top of the first printout, and she traced it with her pen. The header used a 2-letter time zone label that did not match the server region, and the offset would shift noon by 1 hour. The rear camera time showed one set of minutes, and the hallway printer showed another set on a slightly different clock. That meant the warning at noon really pointed to 11, and her walk covered that window. She told Karim that the warning might mask an entry a few minutes earlier, and he nodded slowly as the idea settled. He pulled the controller settings and found a daylight rule applied twice, and the vendor menu allowed only one checkbox. He disabled the duplicate flag and printed a fresh log, and the warning line now read 11:58 after correction. That timestamp matched the voicemail and the rear camera movement on the dot. With the corrected time, the man in the jacket appeared at the stairs exactly when her door reacted, and the picture sharpened. Vina confirmed her quick run for pillowcases at 11:56 by wristwatch memory, and Felton's soft knock memory seemed solid enough. Karim called the non-emergency line again with the refined time and the clearer description, and the dispatcher thanked him for the update. Later that afternoon, a patrol unit stopped by and reviewed the printed clips and the fixed audit trail, and they asked simple questions. They said a regional scam had targeted small motels by posing as vendor reps, and the goal was to test doors for forgotten valuables. They said the suspects favored just checked rooms with early occupancy, and a front desk distraction sometimes played a part. They took the folder details and the logo sketch and said they would file a report. Tamsin finished her interviews with the door double-latched, and she kept one eye on the hallway mirror when grabbing ice. She moved her wallet to the safe and spread her notes across the desk, and the scene felt accountable now. She typed a short summary with exact times and saved every photo twice, and she kept the lock printouts flat under the clip. She handed copies to Karim before dinner, and he thanked her in a tired voice. Before she slept, she replayed the day with a practical mind, and she measured her fears against the evidence. The door lock warning at noon had sounded alarming and mysterious, and the correction removed some dramatic weight. The network's skips created suspicion, yet they explained themselves when matched with weather alerts and stairwell footage. The man in the jacket had moved like a test rather than a charge, and his exit suggested caution over violence. The next morning, a call from the dispatcher confirmed a minor break at another motel, and the description matched the jacket and folder. They said nobody was hurt, and they had recovered a similar audit trail with the same duplicate daylight setting. They asked for permission to retain Karyem's clips for training, and he agreed after printing a release form. The report would remain bland and useful, and that felt right for everyone involved. Tamsin returned the key at the desk and asked for a printed receipt with checkout time, and she tucked it carefully away. Karyem had fixed the controller settings and ordered a second camera for the stairwell, and he looked relieved. He said he would schedule a vendor review of the master key sequence, and he promised to retrain the desk on early room openings. He thanked her again for being patient and methodical, and his posture finally eased. She drove away with the highway steady and uncomplicated, and the motel shrank in the rear view until it was another box. She told herself that most mysteries feel bigger when unnamed, and this one had a tidy frame now. The log had raised a warning at noon, yet the truth landed minutes earlier, and the whole story hung by a misaligned clock. She kept the copies in a folder labeled Motel Room Audit, and she let the day be ordinary again. The stories. Ranger Station Ledger flagged a missing permit at dawn. At first light, the Ranger Station Ledger spat out an alert that one backcountry permit number did not reconcile with issued copies. The overnight dispatcher circled the entry in red marker and wrote missing, which was the only word nobody wanted to see. Latham Reyes was 39 and worked as a field ranger who managed trailheads, radios, and the old metal key cabinet. He clocked in early, poured coffee into a chipped mug, then read the ledger twice and felt the room shrink. The permit number matched a reservation tied to a solo hiker who had not checked out by yesterday's sunset. The name read Tomas Halper, age 37, and the emergency contact line ended with no answer recorded. The station had a routine for this exact situation, which looked simple on paper and complicated in real life. He pulled the overnight radio log and the reservation printouts, then called the county dispatch desk for archived calls. The dispatcher on duty answered with a clipped voice and confirmed one brief call near dusk from a nearby pullout. The call dropped before the location pinged twice, so they logged it as incomplete. The park sat in a mountain chain that people photographed from a highway turnout that smelled like hot breaks in summer. Locals said the place had thin borders where trails overlapped with old timber tracks and forgotten mining access roads. Latham set a simple goal for the day, which was to verify whether Tomas walked out early and skipped the desk. Some hikers did that, and he hated how often it fooled staff into sounding alarms. He decided to check cameras at the east exit and the service road past the old quarry first. He taped the ledger alert to his clipboard, added radio times from the night log, then headed for the truck with a paper map. A gray Subaru with mud caked behind the plates sat in the day lot under a fading trailhead sign. The plate number matched the permit file, so the vehicle check became the trigger that changed the plan entirely. His voice on the radio stayed steady, but he felt that familiar pressure behind the eyes that always came with missing cars. The last ranger who ignored a parked car overnight still had nightmares about the aftermath that followed. Latham walked a slow circle around the Subaru and took photos of the interior through the windows. He counted a blue windbreaker, a gas station coffee cup, a folded receipt, and an orange wrapper with the corner torn off. He logged the items in his notes and called the plate to the county line to confirm registration. The response came back clean, with a mailing address to a city 2 hours away and no active warrants. Two backpackers in their late 20s shuffled by and looked at the Subaru like it might answer a question. The woman spoke first and said they passed a guy at the junction near the ridge after a late climb. She described a man with a close beard, a faded cap, and a limp that looked like a boot rubbing wrong. She added that he asked about the shortcut to the lake, which did not exist, then waved and kept moving. The guy with her nodded, then said the man had a new pack that made his shoulders ride up like he was not used to it. Witness statements always came salted with memory gaps, yet both details felt real in a way that mattered. Latham thanked them, wrote their names and numbers, then reminded them to check out at the station before they left town. He pulled the dash cam card from the station truck used on the evening loop and plugged it into the office laptop. The last loop showed nothing on the service road, then a fragment of taillights near the quarry gate at gray dusk. The timestamp matched the brief call window from dispatch, which made his coffee taste like metal. He froze the frame where the taillights blinked and magnified the shot until the pixels bled and swam. The shape of the car looked like a small pickup with a roof rack, which did not match the Subaru in the lot. He saved the frame, printed it, and stapled it to the ledger alert for a later look. He called the quarry foreman on the number posted by the locked gate, then asked whether any crews ran equipment after hours. The foreman swore nothing moved, then said the gate lock had a stiff shackle that hated winter, which did not help much. A call came in from the store in the valley, where hikers bought dehydrated chili and overpriced fuel canisters in bright colors. The clerk said she recognized the name from the morning before and remembered that he used a prepaid card with a scratched strip. She mentioned he bought a paper map and a plastic whistle, then asked if everything was all right, which Latham did not answer directly. He requested the receipt copy and any camera footage that covered the register and door. The clerk said the owner saved footage for 2 weeks as a shoplifting deterrent, so she would print stills from around 9:15. The mention of a prepaid card added a wrinkle that he did not like, because it cut down searchable paper trails by a lot. He wrote it down anyway, then underlined it twice and moved on. He drove to the ridge trailhead and checked the kiosk log where people still wrote their plans with dull pencils. The entry for Tomas said out on Saturday, back by Sunday, route Circle Lake counterclockwise, Camp Night 1 near Inlet. The loop around the lake had 4 clear stream crossings and 2 spots where cairns tempted new hikers into old fire scars. He looked for additional notes and found a faint scrawl that read, "Saw tent near logjam after dark," which lacked a dateline. He took a photo, then turned to the ridge where the wind pushed low clouds across a face that liked to break ankles. He walked the first mile with his radio on scan and found fresh boot prints that veered onto the quarry track despite a closed sign. The prints were deep on the outer heel, which matched the reported limp, and the spacing suggested someone who favored the right leg. The quarry track dropped behind fir trees and came out near a rusted gate with a battered lock that still hung closed. A torn strip of fabric in a dull blue shade clung to a stump where a person might squeeze past the hinge. He bagged the strip, wrote the time, then looked up to see crows cross low and fast like bad messengers. He followed the track to a flat where water pooled in old ruts and reflected a sky that never looked friendly in March. A mound of gravel showed fresh tire marks with an odd zigzag that looked like someone learning a clutch by feel. He crouched and ran a finger along the rut wall and felt dust that had not settled into crust, which put the timing close. The quarry foreman had denied any late activity, so the marks likely tied to whoever drove near the gate at dusk. He shot photos, measured the width with a broken stick and a tape, then plotted the line on his map. Back at the station, he spread the notes, photos, and the printed taillights frame across a desk that had a gouge shaped like Idaho. He listened to the archive dispatch call again, which captured a short, breathy voice, saying quick words that fractured with static. The caller had said something that sounded like lost permit or lost person, then a muffled clack, and the line fell quiet. He played the clip 5 times and wrote down 2 interpretations with a question mark, which was the style the supervisor liked. The radio log from hikers listed a second-hand report from a fisherman who heard a whistle near the inlet after dusk. The fisherman had used a cheap handheld radio with a weak battery, so the recording lived as a line of text and not a voice. That was fine, because the whistle purchase from the Valley store had already planted itself in his mind as a breadcrumb. Late morning brought a small-town police officer named Mara Key, who handled the highway stretch that touched the park border. She was 33 and worked patrol shifts that crossed into everything that did not fit elsewhere. She parked by the Subaru and walked up with a notepad and a friendly face that could turn sharp in a second. They stood by the hood and traded notes that barely needed full sentences after years of joint calls. She said the highway turnout camera caught a gray pickup with a roof rack at 1842, heading toward the quarry. She added that a volunteer firefighter reported an unusual truck bed loaded with tarps after 9 near the county line. Latham held up the taillight's print and said the shape tracked with what she had. She nodded, then asked whether the missing permit might actually be a duplicate number from a previous season. He blinked once, then went very quiet because that question hit a different nerve. Permit numbers rolled over every winter long before the system went digital, and some older blocks had gaps and repeats. The ledger printed the flag because the manual book showed the number as issued to a different name in late fall. He dug into the archive cabinet that breathed dust and pine and pulled the worn book from the shelf, marked 98. The ink on the page showed the same number assigned to a group from a climbing club from a city 3 hours west. The lead name read Rayan Cade, age 32, and a phone number that matched a defunct area code now recycled. He compared the handwriting from both permit slips and saw the same loop on the number 4 in the dateline. That did not make sense until he looked at the clerk's signature, which matched a retired staffer who kept garage sales every summer. He wrote down the name and the year in words so the report would not kick back for formatting later. He stepped outside and called the retired clerk on a personal number found in an old staff tree near the copier. The woman sounded bright and happy to hear a ranger voice, then quieted when he explained the duplicate number issue. She said she used to pre-write permits during busy seasons to speed lines, then fill names in with a light touch. She added that some pads got stored in a desk drawer after winter changeover and might have ended up in the surplus box. That surplus box sometimes went to the annual trailer sale with old radios and busted snowshoes for pocket change. He felt his throat go dry and asked whether any blank slips could be floating in the world with the seal already stamped. She said it was possible, then apologized and said nobody had asked about that practice since 1998 ended. He thanked her gently and wrote a note for the supervisor that would not make anyone cheerful. The store clerk sent stills that showed Tomas at the counter holding a paper map in a stiff hand with a white bandage. The timestamp read 9/12, which lined up with when the trailhead sign-in sheet filled up. A second still showed a man behind him wearing a quarry company cap who bought batteries and jerky. That detail landed like a small stone in a bigger pond because of the quarry track prints and the taillights frame. Latham called the quarry foreman again and asked to see the shift roster for the past 2 days. The foreman sighed and said he would email a screenshot since office rules required written requests for full copies. The screenshot arrived with smudged names and a note about 2 contractors hired short-term for cleanup after heavy rain. One contractor matched the cap logo from the still, which felt like a door creaking open after a stubborn winter. Latham and Officer Key drove to the quarry safety office, which smelled like coffee and oil and a fight nobody wanted. The foreman met them with a clipboard and a face that said he hated unexpected questions on a weekday. Key kept her voice friendly and asked to speak with the contractor who wore the cap with the same faded stitch. The foreman said the man was named Vicente Rowe, age 36, who lived in a rented room above the tire shop. He added that Rowe had left early the previous night because a radiator hose blew near the county line. Key asked to see the truck, and the foreman pointed to a gray pickup with a rack and tarps bunched in back. The bed still held a coil of new rope, a rusted shovel, and a muddy cooler that smelled like lake water and gasoline. Latham felt that metallic taste again, which was never a sign of a good afternoon ahead. Rowe arrived from the far lot with hands raised and a look that said he already knew why they were here. He said he had filed a work order for the hose, which they confirmed with a carbon sheet and a phone photo. Key asked whether he had been near the lake after dark, and he said he left the quarry road to test the hose under load. He added that he pulled aside at the turnout near the inlet and heard a whistle that made him wonder about a prank. He did not call anyone because his phone was dead after streaming music during cleanup, which landed badly but not impossibly. He said he saw a small tent by the logjam and a lantern glow. Then a figure waved and yelled something about a permit. Key wrote it down and asked for permission to look inside the cooler, which Rowe granted with a shrug and a steady jaw. Inside lay 2 empty water jugs, a crumpled fuel canister sleeve, and a plastic whistle in an unopened bag from the Valley store. Back at the station, Latham laid the whistle sleeve next to the store receipt copy and saw a mismatch in barcode digits. The sleeve in the cooler matched an older shipment code that the store had sold out months ago during a discount run. That meant the whistle in the cooler likely came from a different source than the one Tomas bought at 9/12. He looked again at the still where Tomas held the map with the bandaged hand and noticed a line of dried mud on the cuff. The mud looked pale and powdery, which matched the quarry fill used to stabilize the service road after storms. He wrote a timeline that pinned Tomas at the store, then likely at the quarry road, and finally near the inlet after dusk. He wrote a parallel line for Rowe that put him at the quarry, then on the same road, then near the inlet while testing a repair. The lines felt too neat until he added the duplicate permit issue that now seemed like a hinge rather than a footnote. He dug into the city address on file for Tomas and found a rental building with mailboxes that had newer locks installed last winter. The property manager answered with the cheerful speed of someone who wanted a clean day and already knew it was lost. She said a man with that name had paid cash, kept to himself, and left 2 weeks early with no forwarding note. She also said a different name had appeared on a delivery label once, which the courier mentioned when buzzing the wrong unit. The alternate name sounded familiar, and it clicked only when he reopened the 1998 ledger page. It matched the lead from the old climbing club permit, which tied the duplicate number to a person who should have aged out by now. The detail did not mean they were the same person, but it did mean someone liked to reuse names tied to old paper. Officer Key ran the alternate name through an old case index that kept records of search and rescue incidents on paper and microfilm. A report from 2 winters back described a fake distress call at the same inlet that lured volunteers into a risky night crossing. The caller used a prepaid phone and a different name, yet the voice transcription carried similar clipped phrasing and rushed breaths. The motive at the time seemed like a cruel prank, and nobody had linked it to anything tangible after the snow melted. Latham rechecked the gap between the whistle report and the dropped call and found a sliver where a person could move a short distance. He called the firefighter, who reported the unusual truck bed, and asked whether the tarps had looked wet or pulled tight. The firefighter said the tarps were tied tidy and dry, then added that the driver waved like a man who wanted to be seen. Afternoon shadows drew long, so they hiked to the inlet with a drone from the county that tracked heat signatures. The drone skimmed treetops and sent back images of the logjam, the bank, and the flat near the old survey marker. No body, no fresh campsite, just flattened grass near the logjam where a tent might have stood during a short decoy. They found 2 sets of prints, one deep on the right heel and one narrower with an even stride that cut toward the quarry track. Near the waterline, he found a paper map folded in a way he recognized from the still, which made his chest go tight. The map held a smear of pale mud and a faint X near the old prospector's trail that dead-ended at a slide. He bagged the map and stared at the X until it felt like it stared back, then marked the spot on his own copy. The slide path opened into a shallow cut with wooden forms left from a never-finished footbridge project funded in 2005. He followed the forms until he reached a square of ground tamped hard as a table near a tree with a scar. The earth felt too tidy for random hikers, and the tree scar had fresh resin that caught light in a clean yellow bead. He brushed aside pine duff and found a buried plastic box that held a stack of old permit slips with the seal already stamped. The slips matched the retired clerk's pre-written style, and several had Rayan Cade typed in a cheap courier font. A second stack carried blank lines and a stamp pad spot like a kit for people who wanted official-looking paper for a plan. He felt a chill that did not come from wind, then called Key over and photographed the box from 3 angles. The twist revealed itself slowly, as if embarrassed to be simple after such a day of layered rumors and tire marks. Someone had staged a missing hiker using a duplicated permit number and a prepaid trail of receipts to trigger a standard response. The purpose was not to vanish, but to bait a small law enforcement swarm toward the lake while a second person moved cargo from the quarry. The zigzag tire marks in the gravel now read like a practice route for a heavy load that needed a quiet window. The fisherman's whistle and the tent glow created a cautious pause in anyone tempted to check the inlet on foot. The taillights near dusk were a partner vehicle that pulled close to the logjam, then backed out during the start of the false search. The target was not a person, but scrap copper and tools stored in a locked shed near the service road past the old quarry. They found the shed lock sliced clean with a battery saw when they returned with the foreman and a bolt cutter key. The inventory list taped inside showed spools of copper wire and fuel additives that had resale value in cash-only salvage yards. The contractor truck bed dimensions matched the load footprint on the dusty floor, and a partial shoe print matched the even stride near the inlet. The limp prints belonged to whoever wore a new boot wrong, which now felt like another layer for misdirection rather than a true injury. When confronted, Rowe did not fold, but the quiet employee who ran the tire shop room rentals gave a statement. He said Rowe met a man who matched Tomas in the parking lot and moved tarps between vehicles near sunset. He added that Rowe left after 9 with the bed loaded to the rails, which aligned with the firefighter observation with uncomfortable precision. The county prosecutor would need clean evidence, so they worked careful and slow to gather the chain. The paper box of pre-written permits became a centerpiece, since it explained how the ledger flag could be predicted in advance. The duplicate number drew attention at dawn by design, which pulled eyes away from the road where cargo rolled past a gate. The prepaid receipt at the Valley store placed a decoy at a predictable time, which witnesses could later repeat with conviction. The dropped call created a sympathetic recording in the archive that every incident review would elevate in urgency. The taillights in the dash cam and the turnout camera filled the gaps with enough glow to animate a story that felt real. None of it solved every moment, yet together it built a scaffold sturdy enough for charges that did not fall apart. They never found a body by the inlet, which fit the theory that nobody had been in true danger that night. A week later, a different store camera captured Tomas in a neighboring county buying a tire patch kit with a clean, unbandaged hand. The clip went into the case file under reportedly cited, along with a printout of the copper sales ledger from a salvage yard off the highway. Rowe took a short plea on theft and tampering with evidence, which irritated people who liked long answers. The paperwork on the duplicate permits triggered a policy change that barred pre-writing anything since 2021 onward. The retired clerk cried in the parking lot when she learned her old shortcuts had fed a scam, then hugged Latham like a nephew. He told her people adapt to pressures they do not design, and the fix mattered more than the blame. When the Subaru finally left the lot on a tow, the trailhead looked as ordinary as a grocery aisle on a Tuesday. Officer Key stood with her hands in her jacket and watched the tow lights climb the hill toward the highway. She said the simplest cons always hide in systems that run on habit and paperwork, then she smiled without much humor. Latham looked at the ridge where the wind never ran out, then at the ledger that still sat on the desk. He thought about the whistle and the map and the soft faith people place in official stamps and good intentions. Later, he locked the station, and the rafters creaked in the cool like an old house learning a new rule. He drove past the turnout and looked once at the lake, which held its secrets with the stubborn patience of cold water and granite. He told himself they had not solved every detail, but they had nudged the pattern toward daylight, which was enough for now. The stories. This motel room voicemail rerouted search teams that winter. They kept saying it started with a motel room that smelled like old coffee and bleach, and with a voicemail nobody expected. The recordings came out in late winter after a storm knocked power across the county and kicked the motel phones awake again. Rhea Tavener was 37 and worked as an emergency coordinator for a spread-out mountain county that never felt ready. She had a habit of keeping paper maps rolled in a rubber band and a small camera tucked under her parka. That morning, she wanted only to rebalance commitments and check that the warming shelter had enough cots for the week. She planned to drive the Ridge Road, swing by the radio repeater, and be back before lunch. The incident started when the Nightlark Motel on the highway called the non-emergency line with a strange message they could not clear. The manager, a tired man named Cal Rudd, told the dispatcher that a red light on room 26 blinked, and the phone kept chiming. He said the display showed a new voicemail that would not delete, and he wanted someone to listen because the guest had left. Rhea took the secondary call because the sheriff's deputies were stacked with fender benders on the main grade. She arrived to find the lobby heater making a low metallic whine, and Cal behind a counter with a cracked bell. He slid the room key and nodded toward the outside corridor, his voice flat from too many nights at the same desk. Rhea used nitrile gloves from her field kit, then lifted the handset and dialed the code that the placard said would access messages. The voicemail opened with a tone and a computerized voice reading the timestamp in a clipped monotone. The date announced sounded like last night near 10, according to her quick notes scratched with a blunt pencil. The message that followed had the kind of audio that police technicians describe as close but muddy, and it made her shoulders rise. A woman whispered that a man was hurt, and she asked for help. Then she mentioned mile marker numbers and a guardrail that bent inward toward a runoff ditch. There was wind noise and the distant thrum of trucks, and what Rhea believed might be the quick chirp of a turn signal. The caller finished with words that sounded like two names, then a tired exhale, then silence long enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. By the time she walked back to the lobby, the dispatcher had already compared mile markers that matched those numbers on the East Highway spur. A search team was gathering at the fairgrounds with two four-wheelers and a county plow driver who knew every ditch by seat memory. Rhea signed the log and relayed what she heard, and her own words hardened into directions that sent good people toward a cold bend. An hour later, a second caller reached the tip line and said they had heard the same voicemail when calling the motel to complain about their refund. That person repeated the marker numbers and added that a dog barked once in the background, which persuaded the consensus further. Witness statements began clustering around the East Spur, and a deputy noted in the dispatch log that he had seen a bent guardrail near marker 32 2 days prior. The search teams rolled that way in a slow line of lights that looked brave against the blank sky. Rhea drove separately and scanned plow berms that faced the wind, because snow settles in patterns that trap fresh tire ruts longer. She told herself that the timestamp was clean, and that the voice felt close, and that people needed her to stay practical. The first mile produced a stranded sedan with a dead battery and a sheepish driver, and the second mile delivered a drift that swallowed half the lane. They found nothing that matched a serious wreck, only plastic shrapnel and a glove lost last week, which made her think about timing again. Back at the fairgrounds, a radio operator replayed the voicemail on a speaker, and the group leaned in. Rhea asked Cal for the motel's phone vendor contact, and he brought out a binder with hand-printed notes in thick marker. She called the vendor and asked about power cycles and about date behavior when the system lost time, and the technician promised to check archival events. She returned to the voicemail and listened for anything that placed a person rather than a highway, because people leave fingerprints in sound if you keep still. The second listen gave her something new that felt small but pointed. Right after the caller said the mile marker numbers, the wind changed tone for half a second, then a faint clack sounded like an elevator door. That did not belong near a rural guardrail, and it made her write elevator with a question mark next to it, which was not her usual habit. She also caught the soft bleep of a room keycard reader, which could have been the motel hallway if the phone had been on speaker, or a different building entirely. She left the fairgrounds and drove back to the Nightlark with the camera on the seat, planning to map every sound in the hallway against her memory. Cal mentioned that room 26 sat above the ice machine and that the elevator had a sticky door that made a little clap. She asked who stayed in that room last night, and his ledger showed a single occupancy, paid in cash, by someone who wrote a name that did not match any local license. He shrugged and said the guest checked out at 6 and that housekeeping already turned the room. Rhea asked to see the housekeeping cart, and the housekeeper, a careful woman named Jillian North, said she had found the room tidy. Jillian said the phone had been off the hook at first, which she corrected, and she said the window faced the back lot where trucks idled. Rhea asked if anyone had used the lobby phone when power returned, and Jillian said a traveler borrowed it while waiting for a ride that morning. That detail felt important because lobby phones sometimes route through the same server as the room phones, which can create strange behavior. The vendor called back and reported that their server recorded an abnormal offset during the storm, which could shift timestamps for local voicemail. He said the system fell back to a factory clock tied to a different zone, and then resynced once the internet returned, which can mislabel messages. He promised to send a small report, and Rhea wrote down the gist, then underlined the word offset because she disliked anything that moved signposts during a search. The dispatcher added a note in the log with that information, and the group paused to reassess direction. Rhea listened again and measured the gaps between key clicks and the turn signal chirp, and she kept hearing something like a vending machine compressor. She stepped into the hallway and held her phone down by the ice machine, and her recording later showed the same humming cadence. The voicemail might not have been a live plea from a ditch, but could instead be a message recorded in the building and then captured by the motel system during the storm. She asked Cal whether any old messages archived on the server could return as new after a reset. Cal admitted that he had once lost all messages after a lightning strike and then found them again as new after a technician visit. He said the phone guy joked about ghosts calling back to settle their bills, which did not sound funny to Rhea at that moment. She pressed for dates and asked whether past incidents lined up with heavy weather, and he nodded toward a clipboard full of repair tickets. The dates matched cold weeks when snow slid from the roof, and the idea of an old message waking up felt more likely with each line. The next step was to figure out who had left the recording, and whether the details pointed to the East Spur or somewhere entirely different. Rhea asked for prior registration cards for room 26, and Cal produced a stack bound with a rubber band that snapped on the counter. She gently sorted through and found a multi-night stay from late last winter under a name that also did not match a license. The rate was discounted for cash, and the note column said, "Truck Lot View," which fit the sound of idling engines in the message. She then called the State Patrol office and asked for any incidents last winter that involved a bent guardrail near any similar marker numbers. The trooper on duty searched reports and told her there had been a slide-off on the West Highway spur near marker 32 during a storm in late February. He said the driver had fled before dawn, and a passing snowplow called it in, and the car was recovered later without injuries, according to the archived calls. That wreck would have put a person back in town by breakfast, and possibly in a motel room across from trucks. Rhea returned to the audio and timed the interval between the words and the faint elevator clap, and then timed the lobby elevator with her own phone recording. The match was not perfect, but close enough that a court would likely call it consistent under ordinary conditions, according to her training notes. She also realized the turn signal chirp probably belonged to a guest being dropped at the front door, not a car on the highway. The dog bark could have been a pet in the lot, which often happens near the vending area after check-in. She asked the radio operator to broadcast a simple clarification and to slow the east spur sweep while a second team checked the west. The deputy, who remembered the bent rail on the east, admitted he might have mixed the side of the county in his earlier note, which happens when shifts run long. The west team found the old repair spot with fresh snow around the posts and an evidence marker for a past accident half buried under ice. It seemed the voicemail referenced a prior event that had already closed, and their winter storm had wrapped it in new confusion. Rhea then visited the neighboring diner, where the night shift sometimes noticed details people forgot to hide, and she asked about the guest who paid in cash. The server, a college student named Del Finch, said a man sat alone near the window around 9, then stepped outside to take a call. Del remembered because the man cupped his hand over the motel phone receiver in the lobby, which struck Del as old-fashioned, and then asked for a ride to the bus station. That would place the phone call inside the building. During the same hour, the voicemail claimed she requested the motel camera footage for the hallway by room 26, and Cal said the system stored 2 weeks, which happened to straddle their storm. The timestamp on the clip showed a flicker at 9:58, right before the server saw the man on the lobby phone, which made her careful notes lean toward a local recording. A county technician extracted the audio from the clip, and while it was muddy, a mechanical ding from the elevator landed exactly where her earlier timing suggested. The odds of a live highway recording sharing those indoor sounds felt very small. The twist arrived quietly when the vendor finally sent logs that showed the voicemail database replayed queued items after resyncing and labeled some as new. One item matched a stored call from late winter last year that had been partially corrupted, then reconstructed during the reboot. The metadata showed room 26 as the destination for that older call, which explained the light and the stubborn message and made the puzzle sad rather than sinister. The message people heard belonged to a different night and a different problem that resolved without tragedy, and it had been pulled forward by a storm. Rhea wrote a summary for the incident file that emphasized the difference between live audio and replayed audio, then highlighted the risks during outages. She recommended an added step where dispatch confirms time against independent sources when a tip arrives through a system that just recovered. She also asked the motel to change their default message code and to put a note by the desk to call her office if room phones behave oddly after storms. Cal agreed and added a bright sticker to the binder with her number, which made her smile despite the long day. The search teams returned after noon with tired faces and a neat inventory, and they ate chili from a crock that steamed the fairgrounds office. Rhea thanked each person by name and reminded them that a wrong turn during a fast morning did not mean a bad job. She said the lesson was about signals and systems and about winter technology that lies twice, and everyone nodded while they warmed their hands. She filled out the reimbursement forms for fuel and gloves and slid the packet into the outgoing tray with a note for finance. In the evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the paper map unfurled and marked the motel with a small circle. She added a line toward the west spur and penciled in the marker numbers with a question mark to reflect how close memory can sit to fact. She listened to the voicemail one last time through headphones, and this time the vending machine compressor sounded obvious enough that she wondered how she missed it earlier. Fatigue makes patterns where there are none, and urgency can turn a whisper into a highway without much effort. A week later, the vendor installed a firmware update that locked time against a battery backup so power glitches could not shift anything. The sheriff added a line to the dispatch checklist about confirming independent clocks, and the radio operator taped a bold reminder above the console. Jillian named the ice machine Manny as a joke in the break room because it hummed in the same rhythm as the recording. Dell laughed and said the elevator still clapped, but only when someone shoved a luggage cart too hard against the door. In a different winter years ago, the same storm pattern had toppled a repeater and blacked out an entire valley, which lived in Rhea's head. She thought about that while walking past a wall of snow tools at the supply shed, and she decided to put spare batteries for hotel systems on the grant list. It felt like a small change inside a big map, and that was how she survived seasons that piled risk on top of routine tasks. She pinned the grant idea to her bulletin board and wrote a short sentence that read, "Verify time before direction." No one ever found the man who left the cash registration during the recent night because he boarded the bus and vanished into ordinary life. The earlier driver from last winter had been located and fined, according to the archived paperwork, which made that thread tidy in the official sense. The county slid back into the rhythm of plows and calls and an occasional lost tourist, and the motel phone stayed quiet except for room wake-ups. The red light over room 26 stopped blinking, and the ice machine chugged along with stubborn loyalty. Rhea kept the pencil notes in a folder labeled with the motel name and the date and included a copy of the vendor logs. She handed a training copy to the new deputy class and asked them to listen once without context, then again with the building map. The exercise worked because people learned how easily a detail snaps a hunch in half, and how worth it is to test every hunch. They left with a habit of checking other clocks before sending trucks into the cold, which is the sort of habit that quietly saves lives. By late spring, the guardrail on the west spur reflected the sun with a fresh coat of paint, and the plow berms had slipped away. The fairgrounds chili pot was replaced with a cooler of sports drinks, and the radio chatter turned toward camping permits and picnic warnings. Nobody brought up the voicemail during the season kickoff meeting, but everyone remembered the morning they chased a ghost along the east spur. The minutes simply read "Time Verification Protocol Updated," which looked small on paper and felt big in practice. People who were not there will say it was obvious from the start, and they will wonder why teams moved before verifying. People who were there remember the tone in that whisper, and the way good intentions sprint when wind hits the valley wrong. Rhea thinks the truth sits between those angles, and that winter rewards humility more than certainty, especially when phones and storms share a stage. She wrote that in the margin of her map, in handwriting that tilted uphill like a person leaning into a cold night. When she passed the Nightlark one afternoon with the window cracked, she heard the elevator clap echo through the empty corridor. It sounded like a period at the end of a long sentence that finally made sense, and she let the thought linger until the highway bent. The motel squatted back into its season of travelers who just need a warm bed and a snow-free path to the door. The voicemail lived on in a folder, and in the way the county listened to machines, and in the simple habit of checking the time. The stories. Never follow hazard markers from that highway turnout. The warning was simple and unglamorous, according to incident notes kept by the county office. The markers near the turnout reportedly changed positions overnight. Calder Ruiz was 42, and he worked as a traffic sign technician who logged odd reports. He drove a white service pickup, carried a clipboard, and kept a cheap digital recorder for quick notes. He had a plain goal that morning, which was to verify a complaint about missing reflectors. He planned to check mile marker signs, take a few photos, and head back before lunch to file a routine update. The highway ran through scrub hills and freight yards, with a turnout used by truckers and roadside vendors. The spot felt unremarkable, except for a slanted ditch and a concrete culvert with a narrow access grate. A vendor named Orla Finn had filed the first report 2 weeks prior, according to archived calls. She sold tamales from a van, and she told the dispatcher that reflective markers appeared one morning where none had been. She said the markers led not along the shoulder, but down toward the culvert. She also added that her friend nearly drove into the ditch after following the line at dawn. Calder treated such claims with patience, and he had learned that small rumors often hid simple maintenance errors. He expected some prank with stolen cones or a set of survey flags placed by a contractor in a hurry. The turnout was quiet when he parked, and the wind pushed grit against his boots in little waves. He saw the usual chevron sign, the battered guardrail, and 2 cracked plastic markers leaning near a pothole. He walked the shoulder and took photos, counting faded hash marks and a torn strip of reflective tape. He spoke 3 short notes into his recorder. Then he crouched to examine a set of fresh adhesive pads near the grate. He found a footprint pressed into the powdery dirt between the road and the ditch. The heel had a square pattern, and the toe area looked scuffed sideways as if someone shifted quickly while lifting weight. He looked back toward the vendor spot and saw Orla's van roll in behind him with a sputter. She waved from the window, and he waved back. Then she parked and stepped out with a thermos and a paper cup. "You picked a windy day?" she said with a quick smile. "Something new happened last night. It moved again." Calder kept his tone casual, because people shared more when no one made a big show of expertise. He asked what she meant, and she pointed to a row of small reflective buttons arranged along the gravel like breadcrumbs. He followed the dot pattern with his eyes and saw how it led down the gentle slope. The dots curved right, skirted the drain opening, and ended near the culvert mouth where the grate sat partly ajar. He took more photos and a measurement. Then he pulled a glove and tested the grate with a light tug. It shifted with the gritty squeal of old metal, and a faint smell of machine oil rose from the dark. Orla poured coffee and set it on his tailgate. Then she said she had a witness. A night guard from the freight yard told her he had seen a pickup here after midnight, and the guard thought it belonged to utilities. Calder asked if the guard gave a plate or description, and she nodded slowly while searching her phone. She had texted herself a note, which named a green pickup with a white magnetic sticker on the door. He logged that detail and thanked her. Then he walked the turnout again to find any scrap of packaging. Behind a clump of saltbush, he found a cardboard sleeve from reflective pavement dots with a partial supplier address. He called the number listed on the sleeve, and a receptionist confirmed the dots shipped last month to a paving subcontractor. The name matched a company that often handled minor patching, which made the dots less mysterious. He left a message for the subcontractor, then he returned to the grate and peered into the culvert. Air moved with a faint metallic whine, not from wind alone, and he heard a rhythmic clack like a tired fan. Near the grate hinge, he spotted a new bolt that did not match the others. It had a bright finish, and it sat barely finger-tight, which suggested someone opened the grate often since the last inspection. He checked his records on the tablet and found the culvert marked clean in early summer. He had signed that report himself, and there had been no mention of special hardware, which sharpened his attention now. A highway trooper pulled in as the wind picked up, and the patrol unit idled beside the vendor van. The trooper introduced himself as Officer Laird, and he said dispatch had pinged him after Orla's call. Calder appreciated troopers at scenes like this because traffic safety turned on small collaborations. He walked the trooper through the dots, the loose bolt, and the unknown pickup. Then he asked for a quick shoulder closure. With the shoulder blocked by the cruiser, he lifted the grate with a strap and set it aside slowly. The culvert was a rectangular tunnel of poured concrete, and the floor held shallow water moving with a steady push. The fan noise grew louder, and he traced it to a box set against the interior wall beyond the opening. It looked like a toolbox at first glance, but a closer look showed a compact pump with a battery and a timer. He crouched and read the timer label. Then he photographed the device and the wiring with the flash. The timer was set to activate before dawn, synchronized with the hour when visibility was worst for sleepy drivers. He followed the hose from the pump and found it terminated at a spray nozzle near the road edge. The nozzle aimed up toward the gravel where the dots were placed, and the residue felt slick on his fingertip. He checked the jug attached to the pump and read a chemical name he recognized from training. The substance was a water repellent that reduced surface friction, used properly on tools but dangerous on pavement. He took a steady breath and reviewed the scene in his head. Then he explained his working theory to the trooper. The device primed the slope, the dots guided a vehicle, and the grate could be forced to swallow a wheel. They followed the nozzle line up to a small clamp on the guardrail where a cable tie held it steady. The tie was new and left trimmed too cleanly, which suggested a practiced hand rather than a careless prankster. Officer Laird called the county investigator, and the call log later showed the time in clean figures. While they waited, a long-haul driver pulled over and asked if the turnout was open, then decided to keep moving. Calder returned to the footprint and photographed a few more impressions, each with the same square heel. He then found something half buried near the chevron post, which turned out to be a white magnetic door sign. The sign had faded letters that once spelled a bland utility name, but the adhesive edge smelled fresh. He wrapped it in a trash bag and placed it gently in a plastic bin from his truck. The county investigator arrived with a camera and a calm voice, and she listened without interrupting as Calder summarized. She then asked Orla about the near crash, and Orla mentioned a delivery van that swerved at dawn. Orla said the driver never reported officially, but he left a voicemail on her phone with a quick apology. He had followed the reflectors into the slope, then jerked the wheel when the front tire slipped on the wet gravel. The investigator asked to hear the message, and she recorded the playback with her own device. She then called the freight yard and reached the night guard, who confirmed a green pickup arriving late and leaving quickly. Calder's message to the subcontractor finally got a return call, and the project manager sounded confused but cooperative. He said no crew had worked near the turnout that month, and he warned that their old magnetic signs were missing. The manager emailed a list of inventory that included reflective dots and a compact pump stolen from their yard. He also mentioned a former employee who had left angry messages after being let go for safety violations. The investigator requested the former employee's name for her notes, and the manager provided it along with a last known number. He then forwarded a statement from a foreman who claimed the ex-worker knew that turnout well. Calder reviewed his photos and realized the dot's position near the culvert matched a layout used in temporary lane closures. The spacing looked intentional, and the curve guided a driver toward the grate with deceptive precision. The investigator noticed another detail while kneeling near the new bolt that Calder had flagged earlier. She pointed out metallic dust on the ground and a tiny notch on the bolt head, which suggested frequent wrenching. They widened the search radius and found a stash buried under a stack of broken asphalt chunks. The stash included more reflectors, a small roll of white tape, and a bag of hose fittings in a sealed pouch. Officer Laird radioed for a property tech, and the investigator began a chain of custody log with brisk handwriting. She photographed each item where it lay, then bagged them and labeled the bags with location notes. Calder stepped back and considered the pump timer again, and he did a quick test under the investigator's supervision. He set the timer to 1 minute, and they watched a fine spray coat the gravel near the culvert mouth. The evidence lined up into an unlovely picture, which pointed toward deliberate confusion rather than roadside mischief. The dots provided a path, the spray reduced friction, and the grate hinge allowed a channel to swallow a tire. The investigator checked records for recent calls in the area, and she found 3 reported near misses over 2 weeks. Each call described a vehicle that skidded near the turnout after dawn, then regained traction and drove on. A parts receipt tucked beneath the stash added another strand. When the property tech unfolded it slowly, it listed a specialty bolt from a hardware store, and the timestamp lined up with one of the near-miss mornings. They visited the small hardware store after finishing the scene, and the clerk remembered the buyer by a tattoo. The description matched the former employee, and the clerk said the man paid cash and spoke little. Back at the office, Calder compiled his notes into a clean sequence with times, names, and small physical facts. He attached his photos, transcribed his brief recordings, and wrote a neutral summary that linked each item carefully. The county forwarded the package to a regional unit that handled roadway tampering cases with quiet focus. An investigator from that unit later contacted the former employee and documented a series of shifting explanations. According to a summary circulated at the end of the month, the former employee eventually admitted visiting the turnout. He claimed he had tried to stage a demonstration after a contractor dispute and insisted no actual harm was planned. He reportedly said the pump could not spray enough to cause a skidding hazard, which the unit's test disproved. He also denied placing the dots in a guiding pattern, a claim that failed against the measured spacing in photos. The regional unit issued a safety bulletin that recommended a simple phrase for public messaging about turnouts. The phrase advised drivers not to follow hazard markers from unusual positions near unlit exits or drains. Calder returned to the site after the bulletin, and the grate had been replaced with a fixed hinge and locking bar. The guardrail had fresh bolts, and the vendor spot held two official signs warning drivers to stay on the paved shoulder. Orla waved him over and handed him a tamale wrapped in foil while the wind finally calmed. She thanked him without ceremony, and he nodded and said the county would keep checking until the simple things stayed simple. He took one last set of photos for the file and listened to the highway hum roll across the ditch. The turnout had the same bones as before, yet it felt steadier now that the false path had been cleared. He thought about how easily people trusted bright markers on dark mornings when coffee had not quite landed. He knew most hazards were loud and obvious, while the quiet ones sometimes wore official colors and waited patiently. On his drive back, he passed a truck that drifted within its lane before settling, then held straight. He pictured the old dots pulling a half-awake driver toward the grate, and he felt a small knot loosen as he drove on. He filed his final report that afternoon with a measured tone that kept opinions out and observations in. He wrote that a set of reflective markers had been used in a misleading arrangement, and the arrangement was removed. He included a note that the pump residue had tested as a commercial water repellent, not a generalized automotive fluid. He added that the timer settings matched the period between first light and morning shift changes at the yard. The county closed the work order 1 week later, and the regional unit kept its file open for a while. The bulletin stayed pinned in the break room, and the phrase looked unremarkable unless you knew the ditch by that turnout. That plain warning lingered in Calder's thoughts during other jobs, and it shifted from words into a quiet habit. He looked twice whenever he saw improvised markers, and he checked drains with a hand on the grate and patient care. He sometimes drove by the vendor spot after long days, and Orla handed him coffee when he stopped. They both watched trucks push through the wind, and they listened for the honest sounds of tires on dry gravel and clean concrete. The story never made headlines because nothing sensational happened after the pump and the dots came up. The value sat in the absence of trouble, which rarely draws a crowd, but often saves one without applause. He knew the record would sit as a small case inside a larger folder, tucked behind more dramatic files. He also knew that simple markers could pull people off course when placed just slightly wrong, which was worth remembering. The highway kept moving as seasons turned, and the turnout kept its ordinary shape with stubborn consistency. The grate did its job, the guardrail held, and the only markers were the ones meant to guide travelers safely home. He set his clipboard on the passenger seat and rested his hands on the wheel before starting the engine. He preferred the humdrum truth that a fixed bolt and a clear shoulder could turn danger back into routine ground. He drove away without ceremony, and the afternoon sunlight threw short shadows across the service road. The sign on the vendor van flickered in the breeze, and the turnout stayed quiet as the wind lost interest for now. The county would return for inspections according to schedule, and a simple rule would ride with the crews. They would never follow hazard markers from that highway turnout, and they would check who had placed them and why.